Hello, and welcome to the debate, Should Juveniles Be Tried as Adults? I'm Allison Easterwood, and I'm here with Ruth Matthews, Miranda Frederick, Julie Hooper, and Kendall Camp. Today, we are going to focus on four main areas of debate surrounding this hot-button issue: the effects of institutionalization on youth, the financial burdens associated with incarceration versus the lasting effects on victims of crimes, the age a person should be legally responsible for their actions, and alternatives to trying juveniles as adults. Before we begin, let's first discuss some history. The first juvenile court was developed in 1899 in Chicago, Illinois. This was around the same time as the Progressive Era reforms that also included kindergartens, school lunches, child labor laws, and mandatory education, to name a few. The purpose of the court was to give young people under the age of 16 a chance at rehabilitation instead of focusing on punishment like they did in the adult courts. Prior to 1899, children as young as 7 could be tried as adults. If these youths were found guilty, they would be sentenced to prison or even put to death. By 1925, the concept of the juvenile system caught on. All states besides Maine and Washington had a functioning juvenile court. The state juvenile courts were given parens parenti, or the act of serving as a parental figure over juveniles. In juvenile court, unlike in criminal court, the judge makes all the decisions regarding what should be done with the juvenile delinquents. Very shortly after the development of the juvenile courts, an estimated 20 years after their formation, criticism became very prevalent. People complained that the juvenile system was too lenient to those who had committed severe crimes. At this time, the juvenile system treated kids who committed crimes pretty much the same way as they did to children who had committed no crime at all. The process of trying juveniles as adults is frequently referred to transferring or waiving because it is the act of transferring an adolescent out of the juvenile system and into the adult court system. According to the Missouri Juvenile Justice Association, a juvenile may be prosecuted as an adult if the juvenile is typically at least 12 years old and charged with a felony. This is typically called a certification proceeding and may be requested by the juvenile officer, the child's guardian, or the court may request it themselves. A certification hearing is, however, required if the juvenile is charged with certain very serious felony offenses. Even children under 12 years of age may be certified to stand trial as an adult if the charges are something serious as follows: first or second degree murder, first degree assault, forcible rape, forcible sodomy, first degree robbery, distribution of drugs, or any juvenile who has committed 2 or more prior unrelated felonies. So how does the court decide whether to certify a juvenile to stand trial as an adult for a crime? The juvenile court considers all relevant evidence, including but not limited to the seriousness of the offense, the facts of the offense, the type of offense, whether the juvenile has had a repetitive pattern of committing crime, the prior record and history of the juvenile, the sophistication and maturity of that juvenile, the age of the juvenile, the available programs and facilities for treatment of the juvenile in that juvenile system, and whether the child can benefit from treatment in the juvenile system. They will also look at whether there was any racial disparity in the certification process. So let's start with Miranda, who will discuss the processes and workings of juvenile court. Miranda?
Hi. Okay, so during the 1960s, civil libertarians began to raise concerns about the progressive era model of juvenile justice. They argued that despite rhetoric to the contrary, juveniles within the system were not actually being rehabilitated, but rather warehoused in institutions that not much different from an adult prison. If juveniles were going to be treated as adults in the sentencing phase, the advocates argued that they should also be accorded the due process protections afforded to adults in court. As early as the 1910s, criticisms of the juvenile court's fairness and effectiveness began to be heard. One set of critics called into question the court's informality, charging that it resulted in discrimination and a lack of attention to due process. Furthermore, the court treated children who had committed no crime the same as those who had committed a criminal act. Unlike adults, juveniles could be detained and incarcerated without a trial, a lawyer, or even being made aware of the charges against them. Another set of critics charged the court with being too lenient on young offenders. The same criticisms continue today. These Supreme Court decisions in the second half of the 20th century resulted in more procedural formality in the juvenile court, but other decisions maintain different maintain differences between juvenile and criminal courts. In 1966, in the Kent versus the United States case, the court concluded that Morris Kent was denied due process rights when his case was transferred to criminal court without a hearing and without giving his attorney access to the social information on which the juvenile court judge based his decision. Justice Abe Fortas called into question the fundamental fairness of the juvenile court. There is evidence, in fact, that there may be grounds for concern that the child receives the worst of both worlds, that he gets neither the protections accorded to adults nor the solicitous care and treatment postulated for children. In decisions similar to Kent versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles must be afforded due process protections, including formal hearings when facing waiver to criminal court, protection against self-incrimination, the rights to notice of charges, counsel and cross-examination of witnesses, and adherence to the proof beyond a reasonable doubt judicial standard. It seems one of the only remaining procedural differences between juvenile and adult courts are access to a jury and counsel. The lack of access to juries may impact the outcome of the trial. In some cases, there is even evidence that juvenile court judges may be more likely to convict than a jury. For example, judges try case after case and may actually have their own inherent bias due to previous cases. They may evaluate more facts more casually than those would in a jury. They may have more preconceptions of the juvenile in question based on a previous encounters or the probation officer and even the credibility of the police officer. So as a society, where do we draw the line? In the words of one reformer, the main reason for the establishment of the juvenile court was to prevent children from being treated as criminals. According to a juvenile crime report published by the National Academy Press in 2011, juvenile court proceedings were closed to the public and juvenile records were to remain confidential so as not to interfere with a child's or adolescent's ability to be rehabilitated and reintegrated into society. The very language used in juvenile court underscored these differences. Juveniles are not charged with crimes, but rather with delinquencies. They are not found guilty, but rather are considered delinquent, and they are not sent to prison, but to training school or reformatory.
Thank you, Miranda. You gave some great thought-provoking facts regarding trying juveniles as adults, what rehabilitation looks like for youth, and whether judge and no jury is really the most effective way to process juvenile offenders. Now let's go to Kendall for her discussion on the effects of institutionalization on youth. Kendall?
Hello. Many negative effects can be linked to long-term institutionalization of youth, including physically, mentally, and educationally. For instance, some research states that long sentences do not lower recidivism. However, increased recidivism has been linked to community-based programs, suggesting that that might be the better way to go about things. Youth are also at a high risk for abuse, both physical and sexual, in the prison system. In male prisons particularly, adolescents are at a higher risk than adults because of age, average size, and maturity level. This risk increases even more for male adolescents the younger they are, and also if they are a minority. Many institutionalized youth experience mental health problems at a higher rate, including depression, suicide or suicidal ideation, and substance abuse. Even though substance abuse has been a major problem and they are higher risk, many facilities do not offer treatment. Having no treatment can lead to reoffending. They are also more likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. This may be because of stress factors like social isolation, idleness, abuse or bullying, all of which can lead to low self-esteem. An additional stressor is the separation from their family. One study done in Michigan showed that juveniles in adult prisons were 37 more times likely to have depression than juveniles that were in juvenile facilities, regardless of their background. This may be due to higher rates of stress stemming from being incarcerated with adult offenders. Another study in the United States found that 52% of incarcerated juveniles had suicidal ideations. This may be directly related with the lack of coping skills that juveniles have. It is normal for adolescents to rely less on their family units over time, but incarceration exacerbates this by isolating youth from their families and friends, which is also probably a reason for the higher depression rates. Physical health problems are a concern too, and they are higher among incarcerated juveniles as a result of STDs, substance abuse, and violence. This is particularly true in adult prisons, where juveniles are at a higher risk for these various types of abuse. Secondarily, adolescent obesity is higher due to the lack of exercise available to them in these institutions. Adolescents who receive better education have been linked to decreased delinquent activity as well. Given that the educational system for juveniles is lacking in, all institutions, this decreases the likelihood for rehabilitation.
Thank you, Kendall. Your argument regarding the mental, physical, and educational risks juvenile youth experience is pretty riveting. Abuse, depression, suicide, reoffending, the statistics you reported on really make you think. Now back to Miranda and her discussion on limited resources. Miranda?
So we're all busy, whether we're professionals, parents, students. In a world of limited resources and full-time staff of mental health professionals, psychologists, child advocates, drug and abuse counselors, etc., is it a reasonable expectation for every offender to be prosecuted in the said juvenile court? Kurt Cumley, he is the supervising district attorney for the juvenile division of the Santa Clara County's district attorney's office. He's practiced exclusively in the juvenile court for the past 6 years. He stated that the fact is there are only a limited number of resources in the juvenile justice system, and they are limited to a number of resources in the juvenile justice system, and they can only perform a limited number of functions. To optimize those services for the kids that can benefit from the greatest amount from them, you have to make the hard call. At some point as social workers, we have to make the hard call of when not to provide services based on adequate resources.
Thank you, Miranda. It is a valid point that there are only so many resources to go around. Should we spend them on rehabilitating those youth who might show that promise of being rehabilitatable? It's definitely good food for thought. Let's see what Julie has to say regarding the cost of sending juveniles to prison as opposed to the pain and suffering that not trying them causes. Julie?
Thank you, Allison. One of the most notorious cases involving juveniles is the story of John Bimbles and Robert Thompson. These young boys were both 10 years old when they kidnapped and then murdered 2-year-old James Bulger in 1993. This murder was no accident. On February 12, 1993, James was out with his mother, Denise, at a local shopping center where, when his mother was briefly distracted, he was abducted by Bimbles and Thompson. The boys walked with James for 2 miles before dropping him on his head, throwing paint in his eyes, putting batteries in his anus and mouth, kicking him, throwing rocks at him, and eventually smashing his skull with an iron bar. The boys then dragged James's body to the train tracks, hoping the impact of the train would cover the damage that they had done. Prior to finding his body, James's mother, Denise, had learned that 2 young boys had her son. She says in an interview with Loose Women that she remembers telling her mom, don't worry, we're going to get him back because he's with 2 boys. They're probably out feeding him Mars bars or whatever. 23 years later, she talks about the effects of losing James and the stresses that she still feels and how raising her other children were affected by this too. Both Bidwells and Thompson were charged in sentences as adults, but they've both been released. And it wasn't just James's immediate family who suffered as a response of his death. When trying to find the young boys, the police went to the house of a potential subject, and seeing the police cars, the community reacted by chasing and yelling at the car when the young boy was taken in for questioning. The family of this young boy had to end up moving because of the attention their innocent son had received. After getting out of jail, Venables and Thompson were given new identities as a way to protect them. Scott Bradley, a 36-year-old father, had rumors spread about himself, believing that he was Thompson, and eventually killed himself as a result, affecting yet another innocent family. Since getting out of jail, Thomas has not committed any other crimes. Venables has been arrested twice for possessing child pornography. He was last arrested in 2017 and is still serving his sentence. The story of James takes place in England and in 1993. So let's focus on a little bit more recent and a little bit more local news. On October 21st, 2009, Alyssa Bustamante, a Cole County, Missouri resident, killed her 9-year-old neighbor, Elizabeth Olton. Alyssa was a 15-year-old girl who online listed her hobbies as cutting people and killing. Prior to the murder, she made a YouTube video of herself touching an electric fence and then encouraging her younger brothers to do the same, captioning the video, "This is where it gets good. This is where my brothers get hurt." When asked about why she killed Elizabeth, she said, "I wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody." The diary entry that was read during the murder trial reads, "I just killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them, and now they're gone. I don't know how to feel at this moment. It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. Okay, I gotta go to church now. LOL. After killing, Alyssa buried her body in a shallow grave behind her home. Elizabeth, who was 15, was tried and sentenced as an adult who, because of a plea deal, may serve 30 years and then get out of jail on parole. Elizabeth did not deserve the right to die, and even though she is no longer suffering, her family still grieves the loss of her daughter. Elizabeth's mother, Patricia, sued Alyssa for damages in a wrongful death suit in October 15 and settled for $5 million. But no amount of money is going to fix the damages done. And these are just two examples, and extreme they might be, they are part of the reason that the laws exist for allowing juveniles to be convicted as adults.
Thank you, Julie. Hearing those true life encounters makes one cringe. The pain and suffering caused on so many levels and the lasting effect it had on so many people is staggering. When you see the reoffenders like Venable or the seemingly sociopathic and callousness of those like Bustamante, it really makes you wonder if juveniles at this level even have the ability to rehabilitate. Is it worth risking more lives taking the chance? Kendall, please share with us what the financial implications are for incarceration.
Well, of course, no amount of money can fix the loss of a loved one, but incarceration does come at a very steep price for the average tax-paying American like ourselves. According to one news article written by Tierney Sneed, the Justice Policy Institute found that incarcerating just one juvenile cost about $407 a day, which comes out to just under $150,000 a year. By number, these states vary. In Missouri, we spend around $100,000 per inmate per year, but these numbers are enough to make anybody's jaw drop and should be taken into consideration when thinking about where we want our tax dollars to go.
Wow, $100,000 per inmate per year? That is something to ponder. Let's go to Ruth for her discussion regarding how brain development plays a part in our debate.
Hi, adolescents do not fully understand the repercussion of their decisions because their young brain is not fully developed. The World Health Organization defines adolescence as the ages of 10 through 19 years old. Briefly, I'm going to discuss the brain development and why it's important to consider if a child should be charged and expected to serve as an adult in an adult prison system. Neural development begins shortly after conception and continues throughout the lifespan. When a baby is born, their brain is approximately 25% of the size of an adult brain. The brain makes its utmost development between the birth and the age of 5. A young child's life experiences, both good and bad, shape the development of their brain. When a child has positive experiences, such as a loving relationship with their caregivers, they are more apt to make healthier decisions in their adult life. However, the opposite is also true. When a child is poverty or witnessing criminal activity, you can have a negative impact on their brain development. As an adolescent, their brain is still not fully developed. In fact, it is not fully developed until the age of 25. This is the reason why there are age limits for voting, enrolling in the military, and drinking alcohol. Somerville 2010 argues that adolescents mature at different rates, and as teenagers, they are more vulnerable to making risky decisions. Cognitive thinking begins to develop during middle adolescence, which is the age group of 15 through 17. This development is when children first develop the ability to explore a full understanding of a situation, develop and use reasonable skills, and the ability to think abstractly. This is also a time when adolescents move from concrete thinking to thinking abstractly. It is argued that the adolescents are able to identify the risks associated with their decision. However, due to the incomplete development of the brain mechanisms that control their impulsive behaviors, they disregard these risks. So if there is an age limit associated with voting, drinking alcohol, and enrolling in the military due to the development of the brain, then there absolutely should be age limits on crimes committed by juveniles. If a juvenile is unable to withhold their impulsive behaviors due to the incomplete development of their brain, then they should not have to face lifelong consequences of their actions. Now, don't get me wrong. Yes, there should be consequences for their behaviors, but they should and need to be reformed and face punishment for their actions. According to Massachusetts Center for Law, Brain and Development, 2019, there have been many changes made to the laws associated with teenagers who commit crimes and are charged and sentenced as adults. U.S. Supreme Court found that the death penalty penalty was abolished for all crimes committed by a juvenile, and that mandatory life without parole sentences for murder was a violation of the Eighth Amendment. In fact, in the state of Massachusetts, it was founded that any and all life sentences for juveniles were considered unconstitutional. Appropriate juvenile sentences should be handled through the juvenile court, where the individual is assigned a juvenile officer and sentenced to punishment that fits the crime in a juvenile setting, not in an adult setting. If a juvenile commits a crime as serious as murder or assault, then there's an option to serve in a secured juvenile detention center. There is no evidence showing that serving time as an adolescent in an adult prison system actually helps with reform. In fact, one would argue that spending time with adult offenders would teach adolescents advanced criminal thinking due to the fact that they're still developing their cognitive thinking traits. So going back to what was discussed earlier by Boyd and Bede, they argue that when a child experiences negative experiences, it can have a negative impact on their brain development. What's more negative than growing up in an adult prison system?
Thank you, Ruth. What is more negative than growing up a young mind growing up in a prison? Good question to ponder. It is widely known that teenagers have difficulty with impulse control and do not seem to make logical decisions. With proof that it is the actual brain itself, that gives cause for weighing the options. With a brain not fully developed, is it fair to hold them to the same standard as those with fully developed brains? Kendall, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. Adolescents are more susceptible to a range of bad decision making. They're easily influenced, coerced, and provoked by their peers. Adolescents often have problems with things like emotional regulation and impulse control. As they get older, they gain an ability to process, regulate their emotions, understand cause and effect and risk and consequences, how to socialize successfully and in a positive manner, learning delayed gratification, and formulating their own opinions.
Thank you, Kendall. Emotional regulation and impulse behavior are definitely things our adolescents struggle with. I imagine that the argument of brain development at a certain age plays a part. Julie, what are your thoughts on this?
What is the appropriate age to try someone as an adult? Youth as young as 2 are able to know the difference between right and wrong. If you ask a 6-year-old if it's okay to kill someone, they're going to tell you that it's not. By the age of 6, a child's brain is 90% of the size of an adult brain. And in the 1900s, researchers believed that the human brain was fully developed when a child reaches puberty. Today, however, we have further research that shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that helps with significant problem solving, does not finish developing until a person reaches their mid-20s. However, even in their 20s, there's no specific universal moment in time when all people wake up and suddenly their brains are fully developed. Some people argue for raising the minimum age that a person's legal issues can be handled in juvenile court to when a person's in their 20s. However, if we were to do that, specific factors would still affect an individual's ability to make sound decisions, like a person's history with abuse, substance use, education, economic status, just to name a few. If we were being fair, we would look at each of these factors for each time a person commits a crime, regardless of their age, and then determine if they deserved a chance at the more restorative protections offered in the juvenile system, or if they needed to be more accountable for their actions and go to the criminal system. According to information collected by the FBI in 2017, 30.8% of crimes which the information was collected for was committed by individuals who are under the age of 25. Looking at the percentages for murder, for instance, 41% of all murders were committed by individuals under the age of 25. 23.1% of these murders were convicted when an individual was under 21, 7.5% when the individual was under 18, and just 0.7% when a person was under the age of 15, which was 67 individuals. It's important to remember that states are different in what type of offenses a juvenile can be charged with, and that each juvenile system looks different because the state is in charge of their own. It's not a perfect science in determining the correct age for which a person should be charged as an adult.
Thank you, Julie. You bring up a good point that brain development is not the only factor we should look at. It is true that many youths with undeveloped brains make sound and rational decisions every day. You make a good point that we may need to look a little closer at the environment and the history of these offenders. Miranda, would you share with us your discussion points on the welfare of the many versus the welfare of the few?
Yes. Throughout history, there has always been a tension between social welfare and social control. So that's focusing on the best interest of the individual child versus focusing on punishment and protecting society from certain offenses. This tension has shifted over time and has varied significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and still remains today. How do you choose the best interest of the child versus the best interest of the victim and their family? In a world where we let juveniles slide by without punishment, we are setting the stage for continued crime and violence. What is the deterrent from keeping other juveniles from committing similar crimes? At some point, we have to say enough is enough. Yes, it comes down to the mental state as well as the severity of the crime. However, at when did it become legitimate to eliminate accountability and public safety efforts? Murder of an innocent bystander is murder. The individual who's taking the life of a mother, a father, a brother, or a sister, a friend, is equally a threat to public safety as an adult counterpart.
Thank you, Miranda, for that argument. You make a good point that public safety is very important. You bring up many good questions, one of which is, where do we draw the line? I want to thank all of you ladies for your intriguing viewpoints in our debate today. And I want to thank everyone watching for joining us for our debate, Should Juveniles Be Tried as Adults? Thank you.